All right, we're recording. It is February 28th. We've got lots to get through today. I don't see Nick on the call yet, so let me just actually, Jeff, you're on the call. Do you have anything? I think I may have added this incorrectly on our last meeting a couple weeks ago. Is there anything to discuss here? Should I move on to the next one?
You didn't add it incorrectly. I said I'd have it ready, and I just haven't quite finished it. I should have it done tomorrow, and so I'll post it on the channel and add it to the agenda for next week.
Okay.
So,
sounds
sorry.
good.
I'm sorry once again for the delay. I had a release this week, and that killed me these last 2 weeks. So.
No worries. I completely understand. All right. Well, let me move on then to the next item on the list, which is V1 Alpha. Well, a discussion that I've been having individually with a few different people, and I wanted to surface it up. I think we may have mentioned this on different calls too, essentially, and maybe on different PRs, but it hasn't been in a central place anywhere. But essentially, do we need a V1 Alpha 3? I have written down the two potential changes I'm aware of that could potentially justify a V1 Alpha 3. And I wanted to spend some time discussing those here in one kind of central place. One of them is the idea of renaming reference policy. I have gotten some feedback, both internally and externally, that the name of reference policy is confusing. I've had people confused that reference policy is just one of our other, policy attachment type things. So if you think of a concept like timeout policy or retry policy, and then alongside that you see reference policy, and you say, well, surely this is the same thing, and it's actually pretty different. I get how that's confusing. It's unfortunate that the naming ended up the way it is, and I think I'm the one who suggested that name. There has been a proposal that we could rename that resource from reference policy to, I threw out reference binding, but I'm sure there are other good names out there. But the idea being, can we remove this connotation with our other policy resources and have a different name here? The pro, I think, is a very big one here. It's that this is a confusing name. Will likely be confusing to users to have a resource named reference policy that is unrelated to our other policy efforts and resources. I completely get and understand that. The cons that I have come up with are unfortunately also compelling. One, I had a chat in SIG API machinery on Slack about what can we even do? There's not a whole lot of prior art for renaming an API in Kubernetes because it's just not really possible from what I can tell. The way to rename things is to create a new thing and get rid of the old thing, which, yay. Instead, that means we're not going to persist data. There's no way to really take the old API and have some kind of conversion webhook that magically migrates everything over for us. We could have a script or something, sure, but it feels very messy. Because we end up in this place where we have to, we're creating something, deleting the old one, and deprecating the old one, and then eventually removing it, we'd end up in a state where implementations would have to support both. Fortunately, it's worth pointing out, whenever you think of you need to support both things, immediately you think of conflicts. Fortunately, conflicts are not an issue here. It's a purely additive API, so you can't actually conflict. You just add new things that are allowed. But it is still extra effort for every implementation out there. The other con I wanted to mention is, reference policy, I think, got inspiration from, at least in terms of naming, network policy. So there is at least some prior art for a name like this. It may not be the end of the world, but I just want to throw this out there and see Any other pros or cons people can think of? Any other comments on this one before I get to the next one?
I just had a thought then. I suggested as well that yeah, reference policies are confusing because of the policy thing too. But it feels like the other option we have here is to change the policy thing, which I don't really think many people have implemented too much yet, to change the type, like the suggested name of those things. That would probably be easier and wouldn't then involve renaming reference policy. I literally only just thought of that. But yeah, I think that might be more viable. And that would then not be a breaking API change because that's all custom API anyway, right? Like that might be a way to dodge this problem. I think your point about reference policy being similar to network policy is pretty good. I mean, I think there's probably also I think Rob, you made the point that it's a little bit more like an RBAC thing than it is like network policy. Like, yeah, it's more like an RBAC thing. So using binding or some other RBAC related verb kind of makes sense too, though. So that's on the other side. So yeah, I think I'm kind of in a similar spot to you, Rob, is that this one feels like it's a bit 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And like, it doesn't feel like there's really any good choices here to me.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a good idea to maybe, I mean, unfortunately, policy is such a good name for the other concept, but
yeah, exactly.
You know,
yeah. I was just thinking, what else could we call it? Like, you can't call it overrides or defaults because maybe you're using the other part of it, right? Like,
yeah. So need to give some thought to this one. I am very open to ideas on this. I am not, I mean, there's just no prior art that I can find for renaming an API like this in Kubernetes. It may not require it may not require V1 Alpha 3 if we're just adding and deprecating something like that. But there's not a whole lot of precedence for it. So yet another place where if we went ahead, we would be blazing new ground.
Think about being on the bleeding edges. Sometimes you cut yourself, right?
That's right. Yeah. Cool. Well, the next one that I wanted to cover here is a new required name field for route rules. And I want to be very specific that this discussion is about this name field being required. If it's optional, it doesn't trigger V1 Alpha 3. It's just, it's a new thing that you can use if you want to. So this is very specific to the proposal that already exists in the form of a gap, but if it were required. So this has been proposed at various points. It finally made it into a gap, but I know there has been discussion around this for a while. It really mirrors what already exists on Gateway in terms of listener names. And the idea here is that we can attach policy to individual route rules potentially in the future. These are all things that it could enable, not necessarily that it would enable on day one. It could be used in logging and events for implementation, so they could refer to, hey, this specific route rule is what we're using to route this request or whatever. The other thing is most relevant, I think, and that's attaching routes as part of route delegation. And Jeff will probably have a clearer picture next week, but I think we all have a rough idea of what this would look like. The idea being that you use a parent ref and you attach to a specific section, a specific rule within a route. So the rule for /foo, you attach to that, and that's what you're routing to. So that's all well and good. Those are, I think, reasonably well understood use cases for this. But the key thing is, should it be required or not? It's not so much should we add this field, it's should we add it and make it required. So I think the biggest reasons to add this field and make it required are that it's consistent with Gateway. that we have a name field on gateway listeners. It's required. We use this cool list type equal map validation that ensures uniqueness. It provides a consistent experience across gateway and route APIs. And of course, implementations, if it is required, will always be able to rely on this field being present so they could consistently use it for logging, debugging, events, whatever is relevant here. Those seem helpful, but I do think the cons may outweigh the pros here. I think none of the potential use cases described above actually need this field to be required. They're all possible, at least from my perspective, if the field is optional. We can choose to implement uniqueness validation for an optional field. It just would have to involve custom logic in our validating webhook. We can, require name to be specified for every route rule that, but the real concern that I have here is requiring name to be specified for every route rule adds this unnecessary verbosity. So you can imagine that we have a very large number of route rules compared to gateway listeners. Like you can imagine you have a single gateway with 80 and 443 listening as a rough example, right? And then you have lots of different route rules attached to that. We've added significantly more cost if every route rule also has to include a name. I think it's a little bit different math than the gateway listener name and a required name field there. And I think that the use cases we're describing here, although they're useful, are not something that everyone is going to use. Attaching policy to an individual route rule, sure. Attaching routes as part of route delegation. I think these are very cool features, but they feel very advanced. And I had not added this one yet, but I've brought it up before that the whole idea of route rules is entirely optional, right? A route rule is really just a shortcut. You can accomplish the same thing by just having multiple smaller routes if you really need to. So again, this feels not as relevant as or required as what we've done with gateway listener name, where having a single gateway is really meaningful there in many cases. So these are my thoughts. Okay, I should add one last thing, and that is that this is the one change that I can think of where there's just absolutely no path for conversion. Well, almost no path. We could do this fun thing where we have a conversion webhook that actually populates like generated values for route rule names, but that feels messy and maybe confusing if we have, again, I expect our V1 Alpha 2 user base is not massive, so we shouldn't put tons of weight on this, but it is still a consideration that it is a relatively painful change. It's one of those things where users can't just change the API version and apply. They need to change the API version and do some manual effort to make a change here. So those are my thoughts on V1 Alpha 3, but I know there has been broader discussion and there may be other things I'm missing here. So let me take some time and open it up. I've spoken a lot. Does anyone have any thoughts or feelings on this one?
I saw Jeff and Michael, I think, both on mute before you.
Yeah, so
Jeff,
Mike's one of my engineers, so and he's been helping me with the route spec stuff or route delegation. Sorry. So I could almost show you guys what we're going to propose here, but basically we were thinking of adding in a for matches in the HTTP route, we'd add in like a section name, so that you could in a child route you could reference maybe this would be easier if I shared my screen. That work, Ron?
Yes, let me figure out how to allow. Yeah, okay, you should be able to now.
All right. Oh, you're still sharing, it looks like.
One sec. Maybe now.
Okay. Right. Hopefully you can see this now. Okay, I see nods, good. So what we're looking at is, and I'm struggling with the auto formatting in Google Docs, so which I'm sure several of you are quite familiar with. But the basic idea would be for each set of match criteria, we could add a section name to, but only if we wanted to do delegation. So I'd have a criteria here, match something, or and there might be more than just path, right? It could be, like header. So here's struggle trying to. Here's my formatting issues. But then you'd say allowed routes, and then you could have another section for another path. But you can necessarily have to have a section name if you just wanted to do a match criteria and a backend reference. So from our perspective, I don't see a need to require naming matching criteria or sets of matching criteria. I think it's optional would be just fine.
Yeah, this is close to how I'd imagined it working, and I agree. Section name feels like, or rule name, whatever it is, it feels like something that is a requirement, a prerequisite to exist for route delegation, but that doesn't mean that we need to require it on every route, rule, or match or whatever. It's just a thing you need if you want routes to be able to attach to that section or that rule or whatever it is.
It did feel like unnecessary verbosity to require it everywhere to us, because even in the delegation case, there may be a small subset of routes that you want to be able to delegate, but everything that those are delegating to doesn't necessarily need a name.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why I initially sort of suggested, hey, it should be required, is because of the pros that that Rob was talking about. I think that if we make it optional, we do need to be really clear about about if you're referring to some subsection of a route object, like a HTTP route object, like what are the ways that you can refer to the subsections and what is required and how does the behavior work? Like if you want to refer to the rules in the rule list via via an index, like, and you have some rules have names, how does the combination of the two things work? And so those are the things that I thought of that I'm like, oh, that's really complicated. But we've got other places in the API where there are equally complicated things, and we've solved it just by having a very clear, tightly defined set of rules that define how those things work. Like if you don't specify a name, the name given to it, like the name that you can refer to it by, is the index number in the list. That's probably, if there is a conflicting name of an index number, the index number will be used instead, or something like some set of rules like that are reasonably straightforward, that remove sort of any possibility of there being no way to uniquely identify a rule or section or whatever we call it. That I think is the downside of making it optional, which is not that big a downside in my view. And yeah, all of the other cons that Rob listed before are 100% true, and I think they will be big ones. Bowie, you're unmuted.
So is it would it work if we say you can't refer to something unless it says a section name, because that makes it so we don't have to create awkward like default magic names?
Yeah, I that's probably the best possible one that I can think of too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think referencing by index is kind of sketchy in that like it could break if you change things. It makes sense if you're like parsing it like internally, for like iterating over things by index, but not for config. Like,
I think that it feels to me like we should be pretty clear that the default behavior about the default behavior, well, if you don't specify like a section name to attach to, is everything, right? Like, the same as how a route, right now a route, if you attach to a gateway, you ask to attach to a gateway and you don't specify some like a section name or a listener, then you get all the listeners. And for a route attaching to a parent route or something like that, then if you don't specify a section, you get all the sections. And where maybe you don't want that, right? Like, but that means, well, if you don't want that, then you specify the section name. It's, but that is long. It doesn't. I don't think the rules matter exactly what they are, as long as there is a very clearly defined set of rules for what happens if you have them, what happens if you don't.
Rob, I stopped sharing, so if you wanted to share your document again, you could.
Without going too far down that rabbit hole, I do think that's an interesting approach, Nick. That would definitely be the most consistent with Gateway. Somehow in my mind, I had thought of the inverse of, if you don't have, you can only attach routes if to a very specific section, like for route delegation, you'd require section name to be specified. But I don't know, and I think that's probably. Yeah, we can get into that. I'm very interested in what Jeff and Michael propose soon. But yeah, I can see arguments either way on that one. And yeah, okay, so let me keep on going here. It seems like if I'm understanding what others are saying here, there is some interest in at least exploring either rename of this or rename of just doing due diligence on what's possible here. That's my take on this. Not necessarily moving forward, but getting some more details on what is even possible, and exploring names for policy attachment. Can we use config? I mean, can we? I don't know. Some other term there. And the other side of it is, seems like, again, this is just my understanding of what's been said so far. It seems like most of us are fine with leaving this as an optional field. Does that seem okay? Cool. So if we're good with this being optional, I think we're in. That was my biggest concern about the need for a V1 Alpha 3. I tried to scope out what a V1 Alpha 3 would look like, and it scared me a bit. It just delays everything and adds significant work. So it seems like at least this biggest concern of mine is likely not an issue. So I had mentioned in the GEP proposing this that we were going to discuss this idea and this, what we wanted to do in today's meeting. And so I'll take an action item to run through and update that. I think that the proposal right now, I believe, is for an optional field, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, and I can report back. Cool. All right, Nick, I think I should hand it back to you. You had a couple of the previous first things on the agenda. Maybe do you want to discuss?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, next one is an FYI. Meha has been picked as the Spring Linux Foundation mentorship project. I'm going to be mentoring her, walking through a CNCF docs assessment of our website to make a bunch of recommendations about the docs themselves and also the architecture and stuff like that. So yeah, just wanted to make sure everyone's aware that that's happening. And so if you see Meha around, please welcome her. She's super excited about working on the project. Pause for anyone else.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for getting that set up. I'm excited to have her helping out.
Yeah, cool. I think I've been spending a bit of time, obviously, preparing for this, going through the docs. I think in general our docs are pretty good. Like, we have good information in there, but I think the architecture needs work. is the sort of the headline that I think is the case. But I want to let her make her own decision. So, cool. Okay, so the next thing is quick clarification. I saw the thing about services new load balancer class spec field that lets you pick which like service type load balancer provider you want to use. And I was just like, do we care about this? Do we need to write down how that will work? It doesn't. It feels like not really, but like to me off the top of my head. But I wanted to ask in the hope that someone else who knows more about what's happened with that field might be able to shed some light. Looking at you,
I guess my question would be what interaction are you considering?
I honestly don't know. Like, you know, like the load balancer class is intended for services of type load balancer to be able to pick a class. Like that to me maps pretty well to picking a gateway class. You know, but I just wanted to have asked the question that to make sure that none of us, and one of the other things that came up when I was thinking about this is I don't think we've ever actually specified anywhere what types of services are appropriate to be a backend in the gateway. Right? I think we specifically have left a lot of that undefined, but like it does mean that if you're going to, for some reason, have your gateway to refer to services of type load balancer, things could get pretty funky, and not in the good funky way. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of say, hey, like this is a thing.
That's true. So I think that, yeah, that's sort of independent than the load balancer class. I think my general take on the load balancer class is that it should be as small as possible, given how service has been way overloaded.
Yeah, it's a strong thumbs up from me on that front. It was more just, I was like, I wanted to have asked the question once in here so that we can all know that it's load balancer class is a thing and be like, do we need to care about this? I think that probably not is the answer, but I wanted to have raised it here. That's all.
Do we document what the meaning of attaching a service is, though?
No,
I don't
we do
know
not.
if that is.
And that actually,
it's just implicitly assumed like it works how people understand it.
Yeah, it's. I think we kind of implicitly assume that it's like a cluster IP service. To be honest, that we really assume that the service is a cluster IP and that it's not using any of the other service magic, and we expect that it's used as a bucket of pods, really, a bucket of endpoints.
It might actually be even more akin to a headless service.
Yeah.
Because people just route directly to the back end.
Yeah.
We might just want to clarify that. That's like a good clarification for the docs.
Yep.
The way the service stuff kind of is layered on top of each other in terms of the load balancer class, it's almost like orthogonal to whatever the gateway would use, at least in the current characterization of things.
Yeah, exactly. Luan asked in the chat that, does this mean the load balancer is a backend? And that is the exact question that I wanted to answer by talking about this, Luan. So thank you. And so I think Rob is just, we need to document how services should be routed to, and that, probably we want to make it explicit that if you're using a service type load balancer, using it as a backend in a gateway is just, it's kind of, the behavior is always going to be undefined because you're mixing two constructs, but we need to document that, I think.
No.
External name is the odd duck. That one is
I hate that thing so much.
Interesting.
It's awful. Yeah.
Sorry. Did someone else unmute for a second there? I thought I heard someone else speak.
No, I was just agreeing with you that the external name services are awful. So I want to make sure we're clear on this. For service type load balancer, it seems like this is not, because service type load balancer is just a superset of cluster IP, right? So as long as the service itself includes endpoints, and this again requires us to document this, but my interpretation is that when you're forwarding to a service, you're forwarding to the endpoints that are selected by that service. And anything beyond that is tangential.
I think true, but I feel like there's so much overlap with what the idea of what a service subtype load balancer does with what the gateway API does, that it's probably better to be clear. This is not a peanut butter and chocolate situation. This is like a oil and water situation. Don't mix them. It's not a good idea.
Fair point. Fair point.
Could I ask a dumb newbie question here?
Of course. I don't think it's dumb anyway. Ask away.
So how are gateways load balanced from a load balancer? Was my misunderstanding? If I have a load balancer in front, an L4 load balancer, and behind it I have a gateway, and do I need more than one gateway to load balance?
So yeah, for the case you're talking about, it sounds like you're talking about like a layer 7 gateway.
No,
like
L4.
what, say,
Just L4. I want to send a lot of traffic
Mhm.
to a service. And,
So there's a few ways to slice that. I think
okay.
it depends on exactly what your implementation considers a gateway to be. We have been specifically very vague in what a gateway actually is.
I noticed.
Yeah. But I mean, we did that on purpose because because the whole idea of the gateway is like, I don't think I've written this down anywhere, but in my mind, the gateway is the point at which you transition from not knowing about anything about cluster networking to knowing about the cluster networking. And so in that case, like the layer 4 load balancer that sits outside the cluster, like that's actually a gateway because it like knows about it. The outside doesn't know about cluster networking or care, and the inside does. It knows how to get to some service inside. For something like Contour, say, I mean, I'm a maintainer of Contour, right? So I use this example a lot. It's an ingress controller, and so it uses Envoy that runs in cluster as its data plane, and it requires some other thing to set up the layer 4 data path to get the traffic to Envoy. And so Contour has a gateway that describes the place, sort of the place to attach the Envoy config, the HTTP routes. And so like that's what Contour's gateway means. But say Rob and the GKE team have the GKE gateway controller that describes the creation of a cloud load balancer that satisfies the gateway. All right, and so both of those use cases are valid gateway API use cases, but the gateway it describes is very different, and that's why one of the reasons why we've left it so vague. And so in the thing that you're talking about, if you want to have an upstream load balancer that is not described by the gateway inside the cluster, it'll work, but like it's a little like I would guess that you will get some impedance mismatch about the way that we talk about gateways. Like in general, we've sort of, at the moment, we've tended to bucket gateways into like does layer 4 and only does layer 7, because only does layer 7 is very correspondent to like an ingress controller in sort of a traditional ingress controller, and does layer 4 is pretty correspondent to service of type load balancer cloud provider.
Yeah, I think there's a case in between there.
Yeah,
it's not Envoy. It's not a proxy. It's a pass through. You want to do some enhancements to the data, but you don't want the proxy.
Okay, so yeah, so you're thinking about like something that using the CNI, CNI magic or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so, I mean, yeah, I agree that's and that is another reason why we left that vague, so that the fact that we're roughly thinking about it in these two big buckets doesn't preclude other people using it in some other way. But in my mind, that's the central conceit of the gateway, is that it's like translating between the world outside the cluster and inside the cluster. I use outside and inside very loosely because like sometimes people use.
What happens if you want to use a GKE load balancer, L4 load balancer, because it scales, it does all the nice things, but you need a gateway behind it to do some data enhancements to the traffic. Then how do you scale?
Yeah.
That should be possible. I'd be interested in the specific use case, but that should be possible. I mean, obviously our cloud load balancers are widely used to route to in-cluster proxies, for example, right? So if you were deploying Contour or Istio as your kind of in-cluster proxy, that's something that that is already pretty broadly supported. And I think what you're talking about is different, but I think the same pattern largely applies.
Okay, it's more, just keeping track of state becomes an issue. So
Yeah, I think it sounds like a really interesting use case, to be honest, that yeah, if you wouldn't mind spending some time like writing up the sort of thing that you're thinking about, then I would certainly like to make sure that we have considered those use cases and we're not like blocking people from doing something like that. I feel like chaining gateways like kind of makes sense. Like Contour is, like for me, Contour is definitely going to end up having in a world where we don't use service of type load balancer anymore because gateway API is heaps better, which is probably a long way in the future. But yeah, anyway, like in that sort of world where we don't use service of type load balancer anymore because gateway is better, Contour is going to have a gateway to describe a place to attach HTTP routes to, but Contour is going to need a gateway to describe how to get the layer 4 path into the cluster. And so in that case, like you're kind of going to have like, in effect, like kind of a chaining kind of thing happening where the exposing Envoy gateway then sort of leads to the ingress controller gateway.
how would you autoscale that then?
How would you autoscale it? Well, it's kind of up to your control plane that manages the gateway to know about how the various scaling needs to happen, like what dimensions needs to be scaled on, right? So the provide the layer 4 path load balancer is going to have different scaling requirements to the Contour and Envoy one. And so like it's kind of up to the implementation that takes the gateway config and figures out how to make it work to figure out how to scale those things. We have not addressed programmatic, like configuring inside the gateway anything about how it would scale at the moment. It's like that's 100% outside the gateway's limit at this time. Should we put something in there? Probably. Like it'd be nice to have some way to say this is what we expect the gateway to do, but we haven't considered that at all yet.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to.
That's a great question. Great question.
Yeah, these are great questions, and yeah, please follow up if you have any other questions, want to describe what you're thinking of. We're very interested in use cases here. We've been, as Nick mentioned, we've been largely focused on 2 buckets of implementations right now, but being aware of other types of implementations or potential implementations or use cases will help us build a better API. So
absolutely.
Okay, will do.
Great.
Yeah. I think one thing that was related to that I see Lewin asking some questions in the chat that she and I had a chat about the other day that I think we've not done a good job of making clear at the moment is that, and this is a reasonably specific technical point, but I wanted to call it out here, that in a gateway object, you have listeners and you have addresses, and the default behavior and the expected behavior for an implementation is that all listeners are associated with all addresses in any one specific gateway. I think we've implied that, but I don't think we've made that super explicit that that's how, if you have 5 IP addresses and 2 listeners, then you're going to end up with like 10 listener IP combinations. Right? And so I think that it's really important that we make that very clear that that's the expected contract. And if you want to have, like, I think Lewin and I were talking about what happens when you want to have, if you want to have this IP expose only this set of routes, then you need to have 2 gateways. The gateway, the IP is a part of the gateway definition. The binding of a gateway essentially binds things that listen to addresses to listen on. And that's what a gateway actually is in spec terms.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Are there specific use cases that would challenge those assumptions that, are we wanting to have IP per listener in certain use cases, for example?
Yeah, that would definitely be a question, but I think the assumption that we have made at this point is what I said. And so if we want to do something different, then we need to write down what I've said is assumed in the API at the moment. And if we're going to change that, then we need to change it like real soon, because once we go to beta, this is exactly the sort of thing that we need to write down before we go to beta so that everyone is doing the same behavior when we get to beta.
Yeah, agreed. Cool.
I think just to answer the exact question you asked, in my mind, I can't think of any use case that involves like subdividing the addresses and stuff that wouldn't be better handled with more smaller gateway objects that get merged together to configure a single data plane, which again is 100% okay. It's not like a hard thing that one gateway equals one data plane. You're allowed to take a set of gateways under a gateway class and collapse them together in some way that makes sense to your implementation.
Makes sense to me. Cool. Any other discussion before we get into PR issue triage? Okay. Cool. All right, let me run off to PR and issue triage. I've been out of office for a bit, so I'm a bit rusty on what's happening here. If anyone has issues or PRs that you know need attention, please highlight them. I definitely don't want to miss anything here. I think what we've seen is a few of these issues at the top that have been updated recently are just removing the stale life cycle. I think, Nick, you've been handling the mentorship project, so we're good there. I think we just had someone volunteer for this validation task. Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure. It looks like we only have this for partially done. Okay. So maybe we need to follow. I don't know. I don't think this person is on the call right now, but just can clarify that this still needs some work. Next is conditions for policy attachment. I think this is also a life cycle one. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything massive that has been a new issue that has surfaced recently. I think as far as issues go, we're in a reasonably good place. As far as pull requests, I don't know of anything. Oh, yes, Nick, I'm sorry. I owe you a review on this one.
Yes, thank
you. So this one is very much on me and anyone else who wants to review it. It does very much look like it works.
It's pretty hard to test because we kind of need the full Prow infrastructure to properly test, but I'm pretty confident that I can't think of any way that I've messed it up. If you please read through and tell me what you think, but yeah, I'm pretty confident I've got it right. We won't really know for sure until we cut our next December release. Yay releases, but we should at least see the main images as they get released be updated.
Yeah, makes sense.
This is gonna be helpful. This is required for me to be able to do this, so that then the whole idea is to make it so that we have like basically a kubectl apply YAML, a ready YAML that will create a namespace, install the admission webhook, install the CIDs, all that sort of stuff. This is all about making sure that the admission webhook is built and tagged in the right way to make that easier. And then once we've done that, once we've got that there, then that's like, in my mind, this is all stuff that we need to do before we can go beta. We need to have consistent install method. We need to have, basically ideally a one-liner that says apply this thing, in the standard, DevOps YOLO way of, curl pipe to bash that is kubectl apply some random thing from the internet. But even if we want people to be able to do more safe things than just doing that, having that is a prerequisite for being able to do more safe things. I have like a set of YAMLs that will do this, and a single YAML that you can render and do the thing that you can include in your tutorial that says, to get the gateway API working, apply at this version, and then you can apply the 0.4.1 release bundle that will give you, or the experimental or stable release bundles, and that will give you the correct versions of the CIDs and the webhook that enforces them, all that sort of stuff. So that then in your conformance CI and all that sort of stuff, you've got a standard thing you do at the start of the thing to make sure it works.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for taking this on. I wonder if this is something that justifies another patch release to 0.4.2, whatever it is. Maybe we could experiment with like a 0.4.2 RC, RC1, RC2, until we know that we have an image pushing the way we expect it to.
Yeah.
And then just cut a patch release that includes a webhook.
And the YAMLs and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that would make sense. Yeah. And that
Cool.
way we can exercise all of this.
Yep.
Exercise all of this functionality properly. Yeah.
Yep.
Agreed.
Great. Awesome. No, I think that's good. So I owe you a review on this one, but looks good from what I've seen. I don't think this person's on the call right now, but
I'm here. Yeah.
oh, thanks, Richard. I think I probably owe you another review on this as well. What's the current status?
Yeah. So sorry for the long turnaround time on the response to the reviews, but I just got that in before the meeting. I did make a change to it, and that's also why there was some latency on this. I ran into some issues in terms of implementability for the merge rules. So those have changed once again. The new proposal is to not allow hostname sharing between HTTP routes and gRPC routes. And that solved a lot of issues in the traffic director implementation that I've been looking at, and I imagine it will do the same for other implementations as well. The other big change I've made here is it was pointed out that the HTTP and HTTPS protocol types do not imply support for HTTP2. So I've explicitly added in H2 and H2C protocol types. Feel free to bike shed the names there. I'm not married to them. And then I've also just gone through and done like small fixes. So happy to respond to any more review comments you all have, hopefully much more quickly this time.
I had a question on the sharing of the host names. I recall that there was a use case for this.
There is. And so there were two fronts to this. One was we tried to figure out how common it is for people to share gRPC and HTTP on the same hostname and port, but on different URIs. And we found out that it's actually not super common. We couldn't get very many concrete users of this out in the wild. The other thing is, if people want to do that, they always have the ability to drop down to an HTTP route. They just miss out on user experience. There aren't currently any things that you can do with gRPC route that you can't do with HTTP route. There are some that we've considered, and those are in the future directions section, but I don't think they should be deal breakers for people who have that, sort of corner case.
Yeah, I love seeing it become simpler.
Right.
I haven't looked at the updated version of this, but to clarify, is the guidance, if so, we can't prevent configuration, with HTTP route and gRPC route claiming the same hostname, right? So if that happens, is the expectation that we would always support gRPC and not HTTP if both exist? Like, is there some kind of...
I mean, so maybe I'm like not clear on how validation works, but I saw that there was like a status of, was it like accepted? And routes can be rejected by setting status false. There's like a condition or something like that. And so it would be the first route, like if the first one attached to a host name is a gRPC route, then you try to configure an HTTP route with the same host name, you would reject it with not accepted. And then vice versa, right? If you have an HTTP route that has hostname foo.com and you try to configure a gRPC route, then you reject that one.
That's the same conflict, the conflict resolution that we've used in other places is which object is older.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I hate to add more potential fuzziness here, but let's just say, is there any room or any rationale to say this is what we recommend, but we're not going to entirely prevent or require that implementations don't support both at the same time? Like, do we want to leave that open, as you can choose to support both? Or should we just close that door completely up front?
So the main reason why I tried to make it like a concrete determination was because if at some point in the future we did find that the popularity of this use case grew and the story for implementability for different implementations changed, then it would be a backwards compatible change to add in these specific merge semantics. And if we just leave it open and say it's implementation defined, we do not have that ability because different implementations could be doing completely different things.
Yeah, that seems sensible. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. I'll have a look over this today.
Thank you.
And you mentioned, so the other thing I know you mentioned was the new protocols you added.
Mhm.
These are intended to be protocols on the gateway itself.
Right.
Okay.
On the listener, yeah.
Okay.
Right. And maybe I need to do some more work here for integration between those two protocols and HTTP route, because I imagine you would be able to use those two together as well. Right. It would make sense to.
That's where I was going with this. Is this something that is considered a subset of HTTP, and so HTTP is still
right.
a valid protocol?
There's no guarantee with the existing HTTP and HTTPS protocols that you support HTTP2. And also, I would imagine they start with HTTP 1 requests and they upgrade to HTTP2. So what you'd want to do here is you just start with HTTP2.
Okay. Did you add I guess I can't see someone wanting to specify HTTP1. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, I'll follow up and read through this too. This looks great. Thank you for updating everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I think probably one thing that might be worth you having to think about, Richard, is would it be possible for people to use the gRPC route to do stuff around the automatic REST to gRPC conversion?
Right. I do think that's a great use case. I just don't think that we should take on that complexity in this particular gap.
I 100% agree. 100% agree. It's more like think in under your future directions or something like that, like section, just have a think about it and like, are we stopping ourselves from being able to do that at some point? I don't think we are, off the top of my head, but it seems worth just taking a few minutes to think through, like, are we blocking that use case by anything we're doing here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Cool. Were there any other comments before I move on?
Could I ask another dumb newbie question?
Yeah.
Have we ever thought of chaining routes? Because yes, you have. Okay, because what you're talking about here is HTTP putting gRPC on top of it, and then you have TLS, and you could take UDP and put VXLAN on it, and there's lots of things you could. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with lots and lots and lots of routes, which may be the best thing to do, but I don't know.
Now that's an interesting version of that. What we've talked about, the closest thing to chaining routes that we've talked about right now is route delegation, the idea of delegating, say /foo to a different namespace and letting route admins in that namespace configure how routing works under that path. We have not talked about cross protocol route chaining, like HTTP route to gRPC route or vice versa. Maybe I don't know, right? We haven't discussed any kind of combination like that, but as always, very interested in use cases.
Yeah, I think that one is like, you can eventually, most network systems becomes this directed acyclic graph. Well, it might even be cyclic. Of components. The thing is, we're really focused on enabling kind of a base level of use cases while keeping the API easy to understand. So I think, like, could you chain the routes? Probably. Could implementations actually handle that level of complexity is one question. And then do users have like a good use case that requires adding on that complexity, then that one would be interesting to see.
I think the thing that I wanted to say here is, I feel like the best way to think about the different types of routes is syntactic sugar. HTTP route is syntactic sugar on top of a TCP route. Right? Like the HTTP route takes the concepts of the TCP route and wraps them with further extra bits that are HTTP protocol specific. In the same way, gRPC route is syntactic sugar for HTTP route. And TLS route is is syntactic sugar around a TCP route. And so I think what you're talking about, John, is like taking a TCP route and using it to describe the TCP specific parts of a connection, and then having another route that sort of chains off that one that says, okay, this is the HTTP parts of this config. But the way that we've designed the API up to now is that the HTTP part includes the TCP parts, like implicitly, and the gRPC part includes the HTTP parts, or HTTP or HTTPS or H2 parts implicitly. And so I think that's the way that I've been thinking of it, is that a HTTP route is a syntactic sugar around like a very complicated TCP route or something like that, or specifies extra details on top of a TCP route, but it implies essentially the creation of a TCP route to manage the HTTP connections. Is that a little bit more is that what you were sort of thinking? Like you were thinking
I was just curious more than anything else.
It's a really good question that I've actually had come up talking to people internally at VMware as well. They're like, well, why wouldn't you create a TCP route that you then attach a HTTP route to, that you then attach,
so the
TLS route?
TCP, the HTTP route should get it. Like if I expose QoS and the TCP, then does HTTP? Just I'm not sure. I hear what you're saying. That is quality of service bits on the TCP connection are actually a really good example of something that might be or TCP options, which everybody starts to futz with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. In my mind, the off the top of my head answer I would give to that is that sort of stuff in my mind, like it's some combination of the listener and the whatever you're doing. But yeah, that is a really good point. But I think again, what Bowie said is we're kind of trying to hit these like really straightforward use cases with like a single way to do it. Like, the HTTP route is about like basically ingress, but better, right? Like, and the TCP route is kind of like service type load balancer, but better, and that's really where we've been thinking. Like the whole point of these things is to sort of take things that people are doing already and make them easy. And like, I think if you look at the thing, design them to be role based so that the config can be sort of shared between teams in a sensible way, and to make it so that all of this config is explicit some way, so that you're not ending up with really important config living in annotations, which is a bad time for everybody. This stuff should be described explicitly somewhere, and that's why we've got lots of extension points for custom CIDs and stuff like that. We have the the policy extension mechanism, possibly to be renamed, but like that sort of thing is the exact sort of place where I would expect like TCP connection stuff to be set, is that you would set at the gateway level or at the route level. Like this is a way that you can take stuff that your route needs to know about and sort of wrap it. You can have some extra config that sort of wraps that thing that is not described inside that HTTP route. So we have a couple of ways to do that already that I think mean that we can meet the sort of use case of providing a really straightforward way to configure easy stuff and keep the complicated stuff to be more complicated.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah, cool. And those are great questions, man. They are 100% not stupid questions, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really good questions. Thank you everyone for the great discussion today. I think we are at time or past time actually. I think everything else is mostly good. I'll make sure to run through the rest of these myself. But again, thanks for the great conversation. Talk to everyone next week, and have a good one. See you.